So as we continue to look at the crowd's response to John, we begin to get this really stark contrast between the crowds and the religious leaders. John's message contrasts greatly with the religious leaders. So whereas the religious leaders are saying you've got to obey the rules in order to be acceptable, John's message is very different, that he actually says the king is coming because he wants a relationship. And actually, therefore, if there's this sense of having an encounter with God, then that should transform the way that we respond. It should transform the whole sense of how we behave. So as John's preaching this message, he's grown up in his vineyards. He's grown up knowing what it's like to live amongst the salt of the earth. He's identified with people. There's a sense of being connected with his roots rather than detached. But let's not lose sight of the fact that he grew up in a religious family. He grew up with a father who was a priest. So he's grown up with a foot in the religious leaders' camp and a foot in the camp of the ordinary crowd. And so he's got an ability to cross this gap. Consequently, when John is preaching, his message to the crowds is an incredibly attractive one, that the king is coming. Get ready for the king. The king wants to meet you. And this is really contrasted with religious leaders, where their sense of the rules and the unobtainable nature of a relationship with God actually is off-putting. So you begin to contrast the two messages. John's message, an attractive message for religious leaders, is an off-putting message. John's message comes with this conviction of the Holy Spirit. He's a man full of the Holy Spirit and anointed in the spirit of Elijah. And consequently, when he's speaking, you get this sense of the crowds being convicted to their hearts, that the Holy Spirit is at work, and he's moving in a way that's actually reaching and touching people's hearts, and this conviction, rather than the dried up restrictions that the religious leaders are offering. We see with John's message a sense of accessibility. The king is coming. Make straight roads for the king. The king is coming. He wants to have this relationship. And John is presenting a God who is accessible and reachable by the crowds, as opposed to this unobtainable relationship that is being offered by the religious leaders. John's message is a welcoming message. It's got a warmth about it that's open and invites people to come in, as opposed to the religious leaders who, as children of Abraham, believe they're better than everybody else. So their message is coming with this underlying prejudice. And consequently, John's message is incredibly inviting, as opposed to the religious leaders' message, which is incredibly limiting. It's really interesting when you begin to look at John's message and how it contrasts. And the role of the religious leaders is to give us this picture of the good cop, bad cop. It's to give us this picture of the health and wholeness of the message that God has for people, compared to the dried up message of religion. As you begin to think about that, let me challenge you for a moment to stand in the shoes of the crowd. Stand in the shoes of the world today as someone in the crowd looking in at the church, rather than as a member of the church looking out at the community. If you were to stand in the shoes of the community and look at the church, what would our community see? What do you see when you stand in the shoes? There's that old saying, you never get to know a man till you've walked a mile in his moccasins. If you were to go and stand in the shoes of the world and look in at the church today, what would you see?